Hello and welcome to the Mindful Men podcast, a show inspiring men to be mindful about their lives. Each week, we'll dive into a range of topics that matter to men and hear from everyday people doing extraordinary things. So if you love the show, please give it a 5-star rating and share it with your mates. Now, before we get into this week's episode, please note that some of the content may trigger you. And if this happens, please reach out to your support networks. It's really important. If you can't get enough of Mindful Men, head over to our website. It's www.mindful-men.com.au. Find the show notes and the links to our socials there. But for now, sit back, relax, and let's get mindful. G'day guys, and welcome to another episode of the Mindful Men podcast. I'm your host, Simon Rennie, and today we're getting mindful about somatic psychology and how this can be applied to working with men. And joining me for today's discussion, I've got Dr. Brian Tierney from San Jose in the USA. How you going, Brian?
I'm well. Thanks, Simon. Good to be here.
Oh, it's good to have you. I'm really excited for this discussion. I haven't had someone talking about somatic psychology yet, so I am keen to explore this and also keen to explore archetypes. I know when we were booking this in, you wanted to talk a bit about that as well. So I'm keen to see how they both work and how they work in the work that you do with men as well. That'd be really cool. But to introduce you to our audience, you're a somatic psychologist in private practice, a professor of neuroscience and psychological assessment, a trauma resolution expert, a drama therapist, which I'm interested to hear about that as well. A facilitator of men's groups, a clown trainer, which I am going to ask you about that. You're a dancer as well and a father of 2. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
I have to ask straight off the bat, tell me about your work as a clown trainer.
Well, I've been at this trauma resolution work and at this healing stuff, and I worked with men for many, many years. And I found that healing and even mindfulness can tend towards being humorless, and I got a bit bored with aspects of the healing arts. So and not only that, I just saw how powerful and healing playfulness is. So I decided I was just going to jump whole hog in. And I found a really cool guy online who's also a professor, a trainer of clown trainers. Right. And so he's published and he's a professor and everything. So I really vibed with that combination of just being goofy, but also being really sophisticated play. I really enjoy that.
I've seen a lot of people in the medicine, like doctors and neuroscientists and all that as well, jumping into this space. And I can really understand it. Sometimes when we work in the health sector or space, it can be draining and it can feel numbing and it can, like, the life can be sucked out of us as practitioners as well. And for me, as someone who's also a client of the same system, it can be very draining. So to put yourself into something that is fun and presents humor and gives you an opportunity to laugh and make other people laugh must be an incredible thing to do.
Yeah, you put the two together, laughter and depth, and a lot of good things happen. Of course, if somebody's really traumatized, then humor isn't really the way to go.
No, not at all. Yeah. Although sometimes I bring in humor into my private practice as well. I use it as a means to get guys talking. And so we have a bit of banter, we do a bit of light jokes, and sometimes that actually breaks the ice as well. But there are other times when we've got to put it in our back pocket as well and not bring it out too early.
Yeah, with guys, right? So sometimes it's like, that crass stuff, cuss words and humor just to break the ice and just feel like we're human and we don't have to keep everything all clean all the time and all that stuff. I think a lot of guys appreciate that.
And so how does your clown training come into being a dad?
Oh, that's where it probably comes in the most with my 4-year-old, and she's right there having fun with it. And we just have so much fun with it. And then the other girls, the 15-year-old and my wife, they just kind of do their own thing. They're a little bit more serious.
So what's it like you've got a 4-year-old and a 15-year-old, did you say? There's quite a difference in age between the two. What's it like parenting on both ends of the young child and then the teenager as well?
Yeah, there's a lot of variety there, and a wife who's in her mid-40s, right? So it's like hormones jumping all over the place. Estrogen is complex, right? As I scratch my beard here, and estrogen going, estrogen coming, estrogen all over the place. It's complicated. But it's fun. It's rich and complex. The 15-year-old, she's just such a sweetie. There's a lot of teenagers that aren't as sweet, and she's very sweet. So she makes it relatively easy until it's not relatively easy.
That sounds wonderful. And so I'm interested, like, this is the lighter side of you, but obviously you've been working in the helping professions for a long time. What led you to work in and study in psychology and also neuroscience as well?
Clearly, it was my own suffering. I had social anxiety when I was doing my bachelor's. It really kind of hit my body really hard. I just got all sorts of gut problems, and it was really from the get-go when I went to the medical doctors, it became apparent really quickly to me that it was more than just a plumbing issue or a mechanics issue that medical docs are looking at, and it was more psychological. So that was my intuition right from the beginning. And so I decided to I finished marketing school, which was not, I think that was part of it, right? I was studying marketing, and that's not my soul's mission, if you want to think of it that way. It's just like, and then, so there was a disjunction between what my deep self needed to do and wanted to do versus what I was actually doing. And that disjunction caused a lot of like psychological suffering that I didn't even know that was the root cause, but it took me a while to figure that out. So I moved out to California and, started to do a bunch of healing art stuff, body work, massage therapy, energy work, and so on. And then eventually I ran into, it was the men's work and also craniosacral work. In terms of the neuroscience, the men's work, yes, as well. But I would say the craniosacral work is the tradition that really put me in touch with my love for the brain and for neurobiology of trauma and all of that stuff. And so as I studied craniosacral and eventually became a teacher in it, worldwide teacher in it, that's where I really fell in love with neuroscience and I'm a neuroscience nerd now. I'm like abreast of the research and constantly studying stuff that probably most psychologists could care less about, right? I'm on the cutting edge of astrocyte research, for example, which we don't need to get into, but just, I fell in love for it during the craniosacral thing, where you actually touch people's brains. The idea is that you're connecting with their brains through their skull and everything. I don't know if you've heard of craniosacral work, but...
No. Can you explain it for us? Yeah. Tell us a bit about what it is.
The shorthand is like, it's a layperson osteopathy. So it's kind of like this, I like to think of it as you're treating the nervous system directly with your hands. It's not like massage where you're adding stimulation to the body. You're kind of very quietly and mindfully touching the body, listening to the body, how the fluid flows are going through the body. And it's actually really relaxing to have somebody touch you and not move.
Mm.
It's actually really, really relaxing. Like most people, like for example, when I'm doing couples therapy and I ask one member of the couple to touch the other member, almost always that thumb will start moving like this on the body, as though it's like this anxious affectation, and that adds information to the nervous system because the nervous system is so sensitive. It's constantly processing stuff. And I want to reduce input into the nervous system because we're constantly being bombarded by little things like that, right? So I have to teach couples to kind of use stillness touch so that we can increase the signal to noise ratio, right? Increase the signal. What's the signal? Well, the contact, the kind of resonance between members of the couple.
It's almost like the physical version, as you're talking about, the physical version of holding space for someone and not talking in those awkward silences.
Yeah. Those awkward silences. Yeah. We can get really uncomfortable with those. And it's almost like once you give permission, though, and like set a clear container for the silence, I think most nervous systems will kind of be relieved. Finally, I don't have to produce anything. I don't have to like perform for the therapist or do, whatever it is, right? I think a lot of but some, of course, will go bouncing off the walls, right? Because they're, you know what I mean? They just, as soon as, even if you say, okay, we're going to be silent for a little bit, in the next 20 minutes, I'm not going to say anything, heart rate could go way up, right? Because they're used to constant stimulation.
That's a challenge when you come into a healing space, is to try and just let yourself just be and not have to perform or not have to show anybody anything or prove it anything to anybody with your actions or your words or your thoughts or anything like that. Just to be. And it's a great mindfulness practice. I've been doing a bit of work in the men's space myself in the last year or so, and a lot of it is just sitting in silence and appreciating that and holding space for somebody in silence. It's a really cool thing once we can get out of our own heads that we need to be doing something in that silence as well.
Yeah, and then over time, I like variability, to have variation and multiplicity and variety, right? Because some groups will have almost too much silence. And silence becomes part of the culture, so that then the desire, the urge to express, like that's another big piece, right? Like we have a profound, in my judgment, we have a profound desire and need to express ourselves and be witnessed. So there's a dance, right, between cultivating and nurturing silence and not being in compulsion around expression and performance and all that stuff, but to not also slide into silence being just another way to avoid things.
I like that is the dance there between the two, because the silence enables us to actually think deeper about what we're about to say or what we're about to do and do it with more intent. And that's the learnings that I've gathered from these moments of silence that we have. And we only do it for 5 minutes maximum, in a group setting and in a group of three. And one guy gets to talk, the other two guys just listen and don't offer any advice. It's just listening. And when it was my turn to speak, it had so much more power just having nobody respond back. And it enabled me to keep going further into what I was actually talking about in the first place. I start by saying something, and then as I'm going and I'm not getting this response back, I can pause and I don't feel like I have to rush into the next sentence, and then something deeper comes out, and then something deeper comes out. It's a hard practice to do as a person, but it is a great one to do. But we're not here to talk about silence work today. Otherwise, it would be a very boring episode if we just sat here in silence as well.
We could look spiritual. But
we could look spiritual. That'd be good for the TikTok. Tell us a bit about somatic psychology and how you got into this, what it is, and how it works.
Yeah, so somatic psychology, soma means body. So it just means that it's a psychotherapy that's really interested in what's happening in the body, cultivating a mindfulness and noticing what's happening in terms of sensation in the body. I mean, that's really it, the long and short of it. I think it came about as a reaction to, psychotherapy having a tendency to slide into just logical stuff and talking heads. And so it's really this body-mind connection that somatic psychologists are really interested in. So we get people up in gravity moving and do breathing exercises and touch the body sometimes and get people kind of, closing their eyes and mapping out their sensory systems and everything like that, so that we don't get just lost in storytelling and logic and so on.
And how does it work? Like, is it just for things like trauma, or is it something that can be applied to most aspects of psychology?
Yeah, I think it's becoming popularized, and it's starting to really get into the mainstream a bit more through the doorway of trauma resolution work. I think that's where the work is most available, because there's most science is there, for example, and people tend to really like science, right? So I think that's what it's best known for. That's where people, like, for example, with my website, people come in generally having read some of the classics in trauma resolution, like Body Keeps the Score or Waking the Tiger and so on. And then so they see in there somewhere, they see EMDR, they see somatics, and then that's how they come to my website. So most people come in through that trauma piece. Another way that people come in is through the more classical roots of somatic psychology, which trace back to Wilhelm Reich, at least in the Western tradition. So he was a student of Freud, and he is actually a bit of a mad scientist, actually. Like, so he would study, he like invented the pap smear, elements of the pap smear, something like 15 or 20 years. So he was like a cancer researcher. He was a biologist. He was a laboratory technician, but he was also a psychoanalyst. And so he was the one that came up with character armoring, this term character armoring, where you look at a body and you're like, okay, the way that this body is structured, how this body is holding stress has psychological implications. There's psychological dynamics in the plumbing of the way that this body is doing its posture. And so he came up with this whole theory set about, okay, this is a masochistic structure. And he started to make all these somatic psychological interpretations about how bodies hold themselves in gravity. And the whole intention was to free up the flow of life force energy. And so some people, through men's work or through meeting somebody that seems to be a carrier of a life force energy like this, they just get inspired to kind of get into somatic psychology through that doorway. But it's less common now because Wilhelm Reich was kind of, he's a controversial figure and still is a controversial figure. So there's still a whole community called bioenergetics out there. But the essential message there is that behind that aspect of somatic psychology is that you come to see a somatic psychologist and they're a bit like a plumber, okay? And the plumber function of the somatic psychologist is to figure out, to look at bodies and to notice where the free flow of energy is blocked. And we become professional. We're trained in being able to assess where the free flow is blocked. Some of the most common areas are here, the throat and in the mouth, because we're so blocked around our expression, as well as our eyes, because there's so many psychological complexes around seeing and being seen that a lot of blockage happens basically, between here, which is, it's intuitive, right? That there'd be so many traffic jams here. But yeah, so to basically go to the plumber and get unblocked, basically, so that the free flow of energy can flow.
So what's the unblocking process look like? If you could walk us through roughly what that might look like for a client that's coming in and wanting to free up some space there.
Well, this is where it does connect a little bit with trauma. I mean, it's easiest to teach the principle if we look at trauma, because trauma is a dramatic thing, and dramatic things goes to my my drama therapy experience, right? Dramatic things, dramatic examples tend to be the examples that are instructive. Right. So let's imagine that somebody gets verbally abused after they've said something. So they express something. And when we express something, there's little muscles in the larynx and pharynx and in the mouth and so on, and in the tongue, that organize that self-expression. Okay. So let's imagine that somebody, when they're young, they're saying something, and they're saying that thing with joy and with pleasure as an expression of themselves. But then a parent comes in and thwarts whatever it is, that they stop that child in their tracks and basically tells them, shut up. And, what you're saying is horrible, or you're annoying me, or stop it. Let's say that they're being really abusive. And basically what happens is that there can be a clamping down and an association between the natural impulse to express and all of the musculature that drives the expression, that makes the expression happen. There is a kind of psychological complex that can get built. The seeds are planted for a psychological complex to get built up around expression. So that person, let's say that person then comes into clinical work. They come into a clinical setting with me. And at some point during the session, of course, there's talk therapy component. We're talking a lot, still, right? And I noticed something about their mouth when they're talking. Like, for example, I noticed that they have a regular muscular pattern where this side of their mouth isn't moving as flexibly and with as much variability as the other side of the mouth. Okay. So that capacity to perceive the asymmetry, perceive the stuckness, is going to give me all sorts of hypotheses about what might have happened. Okay, I might be thinking to myself, maybe something happened like that, like what I've just explained to you. Maybe something just happened in their childhood where they were wanting to say something, and I need to be a detective then to figure out what it was that was thwarted, what aspect of their expression, what aspect of their self got thwarted. So, and often it's the big emotions, right? It's like there's the content of what we want to say, and then there's what's underneath the content. And what's underneath the content tends to be the biggies in terms of emotion, right? And like the big one for men is usually grief. You know what I mean? So, like, if we're getting vulnerable, let's say we're expressing something, let's say, like use a clinical example, some guy is starting to get a little bit vulnerable, and then what can happen is their eyes start to like go up towards the ceiling a lot. They go into a pattern. And I noticed that. And because that's an escape hatch, right? Neurologically, I'm kind of going, okay. So I want to slow things down. And let's say that this mouth motor pattern, eventually I could find out that, you know what? It is most definitely grief that got stuck there. It was the parent, and it takes some regression work, going back in time, to figure out what the scene was, what happened, and take some art and some science to get back to those times when those bad things happened. But lo and behold, it was the grief impulse that got thwarted. The guy was wanting to express grief. He started to express grief. And then dad came in and did his horrible stuff, said his horrible stuff. So then the grief just gets stuck. And then the pattern that goes like this shows up clinically. That's kind of like my, what is it in Alice in Wonderland where there's like a call or whatever? Well, no, let's shift to the hero's journey, right? The hero's journey, the journey starts with the call. And the call is this little quiver in the mouth. And we're going to go back in time to figure out where you lost your voice. And discovering, in the hero's journey is about discovering your voice again, right?
How receptive are guys to this kind of work? Because even just in mine is a lot of just talk therapy, and getting guys in is real hard in the first place, and then getting them talking is even harder. How do you find the guys respond to this type of work?
Well, my joke is that the guys that are going to be coming in to this stuff are the guys that already know about it. Because it's stuff that's hard to explain. When you start to explain it, it starts to sound a bit woojy, right? Because we can be talking about energy, for example, and as soon as you say the E word, it might as well be worse than a cuss word. Because the logical brain kind of comes in. It's like, because there are so many people that kind of, they take the energy concept and they go way out with it. You know what I mean? And it becomes like, it elicits an allergy in people that are logically minded. And men tend towards being logically minded, right? So it makes sense to me that there would be an allergy to energy talk, but like, there's plenty of science. It's not just science. Well, it is science, but it's a fact that our body runs on bioenergy, right? You have to get the energy and the fuel. It's just that energy has been taken in a direction that it's almost better to not even say the term anymore. It's difficult, right? It's a difficult sell to say, all right, I'm your plumber. I'm going to help to free up your energy so that you can have more vitality in your life. That's what I'm not using that so much, especially with people that aren't already indoctrinated into the language. You know what I mean? So that's why the trauma framework is more available to most people, because you have all this science, all this brain neuroscience and all that stuff, which is much more available to guys. And it's like 99.999% of the times I'm using that neuroscience, neurobiology framework, because it speaks to the logical aspect of the guy. And then that'll get him into the clinical work. And then once we get a little clinical work going, and once the plumbing, this is me changing language, doing a code switch here, but once the plumbing starts to dislodge whatever was blocked, then they start to open up their mind a bit, right? Because they're like, wait, hang on a second. Something exists that I didn't know existed before. So then they start asking questions. And once they start asking questions, then you're getting somewhere.
I think this is a good leeway into archetypes, and I'm interested to explore what this is, because there are different kinds of people that come into clinics. I mean, we're all unique in our own way, and we all respond to different types of modalities in a different way. Talk us through archetypes, because I know you're interested in this type of stuff as well, and how it plays out for the different types of men that might come into your clinic.
Have you run into the Mankind Project, Simon?
I've heard of it, but I haven't gone deep into it. No.
Okay. The Mankind Project is a community of men. It's like 60 or 80,000 men worldwide now. There's a community in Australia, and it started in America in the 80s as just like a little weekend called the Wild Man's Weekend. And some of the classic writers of the time, like Robert Bly, the poet, and a couple of other figures, they basically saw that men were suffering from domestication syndrome. And we need to get the guys back out into the woods to connect with their wild man. And the wild man is an archetype, actually. There's an archetype of a wild man who's hairy and just not contained and not domesticated. You even see it in some of the kind of tribal or village weddings still in places scattered across the globe, where you have so there's a marriage happening, and then you have the wild man archetype coming in to intrude to try to carry the bride away. And there's this ritualization and this ceremony about how to kind of kick the wild man out or something, or maybe the wild man takes the bride or something. The point is that archetypes, they speak to our imagination. Otherwise, Hollywood wouldn't be so popular and literature wouldn't be so popular. They really capture our imagination. Why? Because they're part of our design. That's the definition of an archetype, is that these images cut across cultures, the images like the wild man and the lover within. So the lover type person, that type person lives in every culture, basically. You have poet and artist types in basically every culture, sensitive types, right? And these sensitive types are very different than, for example, a warrior type. Where you have a lion man or a lion woman, lioness woman. They're more oriented around boundary formations, creating boundaries and so on. But that's one of the things about psychology. Psychology can become boring, right? Because it's just talking about family and family and family and family and family. But really what speaks to the depths of the psyche is story. That's what speaks to us. That's what keeps us coming back. That's what moves civilizations, right, into crazy dramas, right? Crazy, horrible, tragic dramas, essentially. It's the stories that move us. And then what populates stories? It's archetypes. So the Mankind Project, they teach a kind of a model of wholeness that is informed by Carl Jung's work, namely one of the Jungian followers who's dead now, named Robert Moore. So he has a map of the 4 archetypes that was inspired by Carl Jung. And the Mankind Project uses this map, not at high fidelity to the actual writer. In my doctoral dissertation, I wanted to go deep into Robert Moore's work and really figure out how the Mankind Project wasn't actually using the work the way that Robert Moore designed it. And that's what I actually teach in graduate school now, is the 4 archetypes. And I've already mentioned 2 of them, the lover and the warrior. Okay. And, those are opposites. In this map, in the model, the lover and the warrior are opposites. They do opposing things. The lover wants to connect and fuse and become symbiotic and codependent if it's out of balance, right? To just kind of merge. If it moves, merge with it, basically. And that's so lovely. That's so wonderful. Let's cuddle. Simon, can we cuddle? We haven't met each other adequate. From the lover's viewpoint, we haven't really met each other unless we've spoken poetry together, we've cried, or we've kind of cuddled or something. I'm being a little bit ridiculous, but you get the idea, right?
What's the other two archetypes?
Yeah, so I'll get there in a second. So let's just talk about the opposition. Like the warrior is like has such a profound allergy against that lover stuff. A lot of guys, right, are that warrior archetype. Warrior archetype is very territorial. That person's going to be very clear about what their boundaries are. It has to do with how well a person manages their aggression and so on. Okay, so each one of these regions is like a developmental line. How good are we doing each? Are we out of balance? Are we kind of sliding into the lover and being too kind of mergy and codependent, depending on other people? Or are we becoming like people just experience us like we're holding out a weapon all the time? That would be too much warrior. The other line is a little bit more complicated. The other opposites, actually, it's quite a bit more complicated, but I'll speak about them for a second. One of them is called the magician archetype, or the magus, and it is by far the most complicated archetype, as you would kind of expect when you hear magician, right? Magicians can do complicated things, right? So the magician is kind of like the cognitive line of development, how well the brain integrates flows of information, but it's really diversified in terms of an archetypal sector in the psyche. Because when you hear a magician, right, you see somebody like a Gandalf or something like that, or like the prophet Nathan or something, where you have this kind of wisdom figure that's intuitive and is in touch with the secrets and stuff like that. And you even see like shaman figures that are doing like magical sorcery things and doing things like exorcisms and strange ritual practices and stuff. So it's a really diversified region, right? And most guys will be kind of trapped in just one sub-region of the magician, namely the cognitive, logical sector of the brain, as opposed to the intuitive aspects of the magician that are really interested in the secrets of the universe, right? Like high-level scientists are magicians, for example. And like, I love the science of embryology. And like, the more and more that I study the science of embryology, the more and more I'm in touch with the magic of the universe, because there's like a threshold, the more that you learn the science, that you realize how much you don't know, how much of it is a mystery. And so like, I would say that the magician, the long and short of it, is like the archetype of complexity. The magician is the archetype of complexity. It's a complex magic of the universe. So the opposite of that is called the royal archetype. So the sovereignty, the place of selfhood, when it's out of balance, that would be narcissism. A lot of press is getting generated. A lot of social media stuff is getting generated about narcissism. And narcissism as a public discourse is never going to work from this archetypal perspective. It's never going to work. Why? Because it collapses narcissism discussion into the family. And what archetypal theory suggests is that no. There's something that is huge inside the human, okay, that yearns to be mirrored, yearns to elevate other people, yearns to bless people like a sovereign figure, like a king or queen would bless somebody, or a chieftainess in a hut. Where somebody comes, and this is really amazing in men's work, right? This drama just plays out where you suddenly realize that a guy is just yearning to be blessed, not complimented. It's very different, right? A blessing and a compliment. A blessing is something that you'd see in literature or film, because it's like a narrative. It's like a deep archetypal yearning. Whereas a compliment is just like, I don't know. What's a compliment, Simon? It's like compliments can be cool. Like, I like your guitar, or I like your logo.
You wouldn't be the first person to say that, so thank you.
Yeah. But it's different than a blessing, right? A blessing is, there's something deep about it. So like in the men's work, what we often find is that there's something that didn't get that. And when we don't receive something, you can't really give it. Right. So like, you can't really provide for somebody's wound, having not got blessed. Okay. That's a bad sentence, but anyway, having not received that blessing, you can't give that to somebody if you haven't received it yourself, really. Okay. So why are these opposites? This is the last piece I'll talk about here. Why are these two opposites? Well, as you would expect, the royal has a tendency to get a bit arrogant and inflated, right? It's like, okay, well, I've established myself on the throne. And if you don't have something to hold that in balance, then it's gonna start to be guru syndrome, right? Or like syndrome where it's just everything. Or, some of the clinicians out there that have not had supervision for 20 years, where they just like their intuition becomes fact. You know what I mean? And that can be dangerous. It can be malpractice. So the magician is the one and the trickster, the clown lives over in the magician too, to just keep things complicated, right? So the clown could look over at the royal figure that's too pompous and satirize it and make fun of it and just be like, all this nonsense. It's just like, to the clown or whatever, somebody that is putting on airs can be absolutely ridiculous, right? Or it could be the prophet or the wise person or something like that says, hey, you're getting a bit arrogant there. And that's one way to understand how they're opposites, right? And the magician wants to just deconstruct things a lot of the time, not build some vision like the royal does. Okay. That's my piece.
It's really fascinating and it's complex as well. And I'm thinking about a whole bunch of my clients that you were talking about, where do they sit? Do we have our own archetype, or do we kind of a merged of a blend of different archetypes? Like, do we sit in one archetype, or do we cross over between the different ones?
Like, the short answer is we all have all of them, is the whole idea. And then most of the time, most of us tend to be situated in one or two of the archetypes as predominance. There's some exceptions, right? Borderline personality disorder, for example, is like a spinning top throughout the archetypes, right? Where you have a lot of like excessive mobility and chaos through all four sectors. That's why they get so many shadow projections, right? Because they know all four, they'll know the clinician's shadow, the two of them that the clinician isn't as developed in, because they have mobility throughout the four. They'll be like, oh, I see you, right? And expose that shadow. But most people, tend to kind of be situated in one or two of them.
And do you notice it more in guys or females as well? Or is it kind of it's just a normal thing between both genders?
I mean, well, from the classical gender binary and like the classical man, that classical Western man, okay, Western European, Anglo-waspy type. The first half of life is going to be, we could statistically put our bets on that it's going to be leaning towards the warrior and the royal, okay, in the first half of life. Okay. Second half of life, when testosterone starts to tank and the man starts understanding that he's going to die, then the lover is going to come more online, and often he'll get in touch with his grief. Hopefully gets in touch with his grief. Otherwise he might die of his grief. Right. But for women, if we're thinking about the other side of the river, like the first half of life would be more leaning towards lover, more leaning towards probably magician, that intuition function and all of that. Okay. Of course, they're all together, and then the second half of life, probably shifting more towards the warrior as testosterone goes up. It ships in the night a lot of times past midlife for men and women, men going towards lover and women going towards warrior. So women are from Venus, men are from Mars, from this certain perspective in the first half of life. In the second half of life, men are from Venus, women are from Mars. It's a really interesting framework that I find has some clinical weight to it.
Wow, so much to unpack, and I feel like booking myself in for a session with you just to try and understand my insides, because I feel like it's floating around all over the place. And I was thinking back to my youth, and in particular, I'm going to talk about this one. Like, growing up, I felt like, and I talk about this like a lot on other podcasts where I'm a guest on there, and I talk a lot about these social constructs of masculinity. So we're taught as a young boy to be strong, be tough, and to suck it up, and all this type of stuff. But once I developed obsessive compulsive disorder around 8 years old, it felt like on the outside I had to be this tough exterior, but on the inside I was quite the opposite. So there was this battle between the two for many, many years until I became an adult, and I wasn't diagnosed until 28 with these conditions that I've got. But it's not until probably close to my 40s that I could really start to unpack this and understand it. I think social work's helped me to do that, the critical reflection part. And so many guys that come into my clinic have similar stories where they were battling how they were meant to feel on the external with what they were feeling on the internal. How do you see that playing out in some of your work as well? I can imagine it would be quite similar in some of the work that you do with guys.
Oh, for sure. I mean, the social construction of masculinity is toxic, you know? So, like, the capacity of men to even just be able to track what's happening inside of them. It's like most of us men, if we haven't had some training in mindfulness or in emotional literacy, we get invited to look down into our bodies with our mind's eye, with our eyes closed, and what we see there is just grayscale. We might notice that we're suffering in there somewhere, but we don't have a language for it. So we don't even know, even if somebody asked us, like, yeah, there's turmoil on the inside, but it's like grayscale turmoil because we don't have like the language. We're not given the language, and culture needs to give us the language, or we need to have an education to even have the language to look down inside and be able to say, okay, that color over there is not gray. It is red. That is your anger. And you're angry because of a very specific intrusion, and let's figure out what it was. So it's kind of like giving color or giving a language to what's happening inside, because we're basically brought up in the cultural indoctrination. We're indoctrinated into grayscale, basically.
I'm now going to pivot to your work in the men's groups and how, because obviously you've got different men coming into these groups as well. How do you see that playing out in some of this? I guess some of the things that the guys share in your men's work would be quite different and intense in some cases, but also quite reserved in other cases.
Yeah, well, it's a different level of complexity when you have a group, right? You move from one to one and then move into a couple, and then that exponentially expands the complexity, and then family work, and then you're in group work, and things are much more complex. But there's a level of intensity. Let's speak of it like this. There's a level of intensity that becomes available when we're in a group of men. And like men, like most of us, if there's a sense that the intensity is well held, like the leader knows what they're about and knows what's happening, and it's just, this is stuff that is just intuitive, right? This is energy stuff. Like, sorry to use the word again, guys, right? But like there's just a sense when somebody's got the space, they got the space, right? And when it's well held and there's that gut and heart feeling that the leader has it, that as a general principle, most men really take to intensity like a fish does to water. Like, so let's get intense, right? Let's do intense play. Like, even just talking about it like this gives me the goose pimples, right? What do you say in Australia? Do you say goose flesh or what?
Goosebumps.
Goosebumps, okay. Like the goosebumps, that tingle thing that can happen when something strange and wonderful is upon us. So that's what it is, right? There's something about the intensity becomes available where the passion starts to come out, the repressed anger, the repressed grief. And these are intense, right? The repressed urge to play. So like a lot of our inner child is like locked away, and it's like only maybe comes out with your actual children, and the actual child might be 23 now or whatever. And there can be all these social layers of, okay, it's our first date, or we're just meeting each other. But like when guys start to get into that playfulness space, it's just like so freeing, right? And then all of a sudden we're moving our bodies and being loud and stomping the feet, and it's just so liberating.
It is. It's we do a bit of work in the men's work that I'm involved with, and it is that looking back to that inner child of that first moment of joy and happiness and remembering what that felt like to be free. And it is quite cool. Like, talk us through, do you see many transformations from that pain to finding some sort of a healing pathway or growth pathway in those men's groups that you work with?
Well, yeah, one of the most obvious objective things that changes and transforms is you look at after a 3-hour session or a 2.5-hour session where there's been some intense work, guys have witnessed, for example, the plumber Brian, Dr. Brian comes and helps to get that blockage removed from the throat. And what happens then is this flood of repressed grief just comes out. And the group of men witnessed this guy, release grief that could be, 3 decades old. And it is extraordinarily transformative to just witness that. Right. And it'll often elicit tears in the ones that are witnessing, right? Because it's just so compelling and so powerful. And so then what you see then is like the con game of just keeping up the false self or whatever, that takes energy to hold up. And it puts a kind of a layer over the eyes. I don't know how to explain it well, but the way that I can explain it is that after a group, the most obvious thing is that there's a glow in the eyes that wasn't there before the group started. So a kind of clarity in the eyes that is unmistakable. I mean, we could do objective parameters. We could do some science with this, but let's not, huh? It is what it is. Clear and vital eyes look like clear and vital eyes. And that's what happens often after a group is you get these clear and vital eyes with a spark.
Wow. It is something that I've recently come into. And for many years, I didn't go. I've been looking at them, but I haven't gone because I felt like it was too much in the woo-woo space. But it's something that I can highly recommend any guy who's thinking about reconnecting with their true self, or, bring out some more authenticity in their lives, or do some healing work, start their healing journey. Men's work is absolutely fantastic. It's just defining the right type of men's work. There are different types. There are ones that are more in that warrior space. There are more in the lover space as well that I've seen personally. But Brian, I could talk about this with you all day. This has been a wonderful discussion, but I'm mindful that we are in different time zones of the world, and I'm assuming it's nighttime over there because it's very early morning here. Over here in Australia. How do people find you if they want to do some work with you or just follow you, in your journey?
The brand is called Somatic Doctor. So Instagram is the Somatic Doctor, and then my website is somaticdoctor.com. And you can check all that out. And it'd be great to have you on my podcast because I'm just now, as I said before this started, gearing up to do my own work. And thank you for your support with that. So, if you're interested, check it out. It's going to be called Boundless Body Podcast. So that'll just be starting up basically next week. Next month, I'll be doing my first interview. And so that's in the pipeline now.
Wow, that's exciting. And the last thing I like to leave all of our audience with is for our guests to plug something that makes them feel good. So we talk a lot about some heavy stuff on the show. So I like to leave it on a bit of a lighter note, something that's just lighting you up at the moment, something that you're either listening to or watching, or a self-care activity, or something you're doing that's just making you feel good.
Well, in the backyard, we have a sauna and a cold water plunge. And I can't say enough about the benefits of exposing oneself to the horrible experience of cold water, the wonderful benefits that are downstream from the horrible encounter with cold water. It's just it's an ongoing, just really difficult thing that has wonderful consequences in terms of giving vitality and, there's endorphins and those bliss chemicals and whatnot. So that's the thing that I love to hate, that I hate to love, and that I just keep on coming back to.
How long are you in the water for? Because I have been told about this. I haven't jumped on the cold water plunge yet. Are you in there for 30 seconds, 3 minutes, 10 minutes? How far do you go?
It depends how robust I'm feeling that day. And I've been doing it for 20 years, Simon. So, I'll go through eras where I'm really, really interested in being in there as long as I possibly can. Like, I'm going to just do the marathon this year, or I'm going to train for the marathon and see if I can get in that water for 30 minutes, for example, versus just kind of maintenance, which is more like just a few minutes or a couple minutes. I'm in maintenance mode now. It's winter here in the Northern Hemisphere. And but there'll be another time where it's like probably just on the other side of the hill, right? In a few months, I'll be like, okay, I'm going to ramp up to a few minutes here, 6 minutes, 8 minutes. I don't know if I'll get back to 30. I'm a dad. I don't have as much time as I used to do the crazy tantric practices and yoga practices, 5 hours a day. I can't, not anymore.
Not particularly with a 4-year-old. So, but Brian, thanks so much for coming on to the show. I really have appreciated your time and your insights into somatic psychology and archetypes and men's work. Yeah, and look forward to your podcast coming out soon. And we'll put all the links in the show notes for people to check you out. So, Brian, thank you so much.
Thanks, Simon.
Well, that's a wrap for today's episode, and I hope you got some value from it. If anything triggered your mental health today, please reach out to your support networks. Also, if you loved what you heard, be sure to subscribe to the show and share it with your mates. For more from Mindful Men, you can check us out on Instagram and YouTube, and I'll throw the links to these pages in the show notes below. But until next time, stay mindful.